The town of Mons sits in a shallow basin of Belgian coal country, 17 miles from the French border, a place of cobblestone squares, brick chimneys, and slag heaps that rise like burial mounds across the industrial plain. By the third week of August 1914, it had become the hinge upon which the entire British Expeditionary Force would turn. 4 divisions, roughly 70,000 men, had crossed the Channel in the war's first days and marched northeast into Belgium with kit still stiff and boots still clean. They were professionals, regulars, the old contemptibles, as they would later call themselves, though that name had not yet been earned. On the morning of the 23rd, the British Second Corps, under General Horace Smith-Dorrien, held a 15-mile front along the Mons-Condé Canal, a flat industrial waterway lined with pitheads and slag. The men of the Royal Fusiliers, the Middlesex Regiment, and the Royal Irish dug shallow rifle pits into the canal embankments and waited. To their north and east, across the open farmland and through the mining villages, the German First Army was advancing. 6 corps, 250,000 men, moving in column like a slow gray tide. No one in the British line had yet seen them, but the roads to the north were choked with refugees. Belgian civilians streamed south in carts piled with furniture, bedding, children. They spoke in hurried Walloon French of endless columns, of cavalry outriders, of guns being hauled by teams of horses, so many you could not count them. And some spoke of something else, something older. The locals called it Le Tambour. It is a story older than the coal mines, older than the Spanish occupation, older than the memory of any living man in Mons. In the folk traditions of Hainaut, there exists a drumbeat that sounds in the hours before calamity. Not a marching cadence, not a military signal. A single drum, distant and steady, that rolls across the fields when no drummer is present. The old women in the villages knew the tale. It had been heard, they said, before the plague came in 1636, before the French burned the town in 1691, before the Austrian cannon shelled the walls in 1746. Always the same, a beat that carried on the wind. And always, in the days that followed, blood. On the evening of the 22nd, 12 hours before the German advance guard made contact, several men of the 4th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, reported hearing a drumbeat while on sentry duty along the canal near Nimy Bridge. Lance Corporal William Holbrook, a bricklayer from Stepney, told his platoon sergeant it sounded like a boy drummer keeping time somewhere out in the beet fields to the north. The sergeant dismissed it. There were no drummer boys with the Expeditionary Force. The practice had been abolished years prior. But Holbrook was insistent. He said the beat was regular, methodical, and it did not stop. By dawn on the 23rd, the mist hung low over the canal, thick and white as wool. Visibility was less than 100 yards. The men stood to in the pre-dawn dark, rifles loaded, bayonets fixed. The air smelled of wet earth and coal smoke. And in the stillness before first light, more than a dozen men along the line reported hearing it again. A drum, distant, constant, coming from the north. At 0900 hours, the German 18th Division emerged from the mist near Aubourg, northeast of Mons. They came in dense formations, infantrymen in spiked helmets and field gray, advancing across open ground toward the canal. The British opened fire at 400 yards. The sound was not the sharp crack of individual rifles, but a sustained roar, 15 rounds per minute, from men trained to aim and reload in their sleep. The German formation staggered. Men fell in rows. Officers shouted orders that could not be heard over the noise, and still they came. The battle lasted 9 hours. By nightfall, the British line had held, but only just. Casualties were mounting. Ammunition was running low. And the Germans, bloodied but unbroken, were moving to outflank the salient from both sides. At 2300 hours, General Smith Dorrien gave the order to withdraw. The retreat from Mons had begun. But as the men of the Royal Fusiliers pulled back through the dark streets of the town, covering the withdrawal of the artillery and the supply wagons, several soldiers reported the same phenomenon. They could still hear the drum. It was behind them now, following them south, and it had not stopped. The retreat from Mons became a fighting withdrawal conducted in near constant contact with the enemy. The British Expeditionary Force moved south through the late summer heat, through villages abandoned in panic, past fields of unharvested wheat and orchards heavy with fruit no one would pick. The men marched in columns, rifles slung, faces gray with dust and exhaustion. They had been awake for 36 hours, some longer. Behind them, the German cavalry patrols pressed close, probing the rear guard, forcing the British to turn and fight every few miles before pulling back again. The 4th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, formed part of the rear guard under Lieutenant Colonel Noel McMahon. They moved through the town of Bavois on the morning of the 24th, a small market town straddling the Roman road that ran straight as a rifle barrel toward the French border. The battalion had lost 60 men at Mons, killed, wounded, or missing. The survivors were footsore and silent. They had not eaten a hot meal since the 22nd. Water was rationed, ammunition was running low, and yet the discipline held. When the order came to halt, they halted. When the order came to march, they marched. But something else was traveling with them. Throughout the night of the 23rd, as the column moved south under a moonless sky, more men reported hearing the drumbeat. It was not loud. It did not echo, but it was persistent, like a heartbeat heard through a wall. Some men claimed it came from the east. Others said it was to the west, out in the dark fields beyond the road. A few swore it was ahead of them, as if something were leading the way. Captain Arthur Osborne, the battalion medical officer, recorded the phenomenon in his diary. He wrote that the sound was audible primarily to men at the rear of the column, those closest to the enemy. He noted that several soldiers had asked him if the Germans employed drummer boys in their advance units, as the British once had. Osborne told them no. The Germans used bugles and whistles for signals, not drums. But the men were unconvinced. They said the beat was too regular, too deliberate to be anything other than intentional. By midday on the 24th, the battalion reached a crossroads 2 miles north of Le Cateau. The day was hot and cloudless. The temperature had climbed past 80 degrees. The men fell out along the roadside, slumped against their packs, too tired to speak. Lieutenant Colonel McMahon conferred with his company commanders beneath the shade of a poplar tree. The Germans were less than 3 miles behind them. Contact was expected within the hour. It was then that Private Thomas Highgate of C Company deserted. Highgate was 19 years old, a farm laborer from Shropshire. He had enlisted in September 1913 and had served without incident for nearly a year. But on the afternoon of the 24th, as the battalion prepared to move out, Highgate walked away from his section and disappeared into the woods west of the road. He was seen by his platoon sergeant, who called after him. Highgate did not respond. He simply kept walking. He was found an hour later by a provost patrol, hiding in a barn 3 miles south of the crossroads. He was unarmed. His rifle and equipment had been abandoned along the road. When questioned, Highgate said he could not continue. He said he had been hearing the drum for 2 days. He said it was following him. He said it would not stop. The provost sergeant brought him back to the battalion under escort. Lieutenant Colonel McMahon convened a field court-martial that evening in a schoolhouse in Le Cateau. The trial lasted less than 30 minutes. Highgate was found guilty of desertion in the face of the enemy. The sentence was death by firing squad. He was executed at dawn on the 26th of August in a field outside the village of Bertree. He was the first British soldier to be shot for cowardice in the Great War. But before he died, Highgate told the chaplain who attended him that the drum had stopped. He said it had gone quiet the moment he left the column. He said he could not hear it anymore. And he said that meant it was not following him. It was following the regiment. The British Expeditionary Force fell back 200 miles in 13 days. They marched through heat that cracked the roads and raised dust clouds visible for miles. They marched through rainstorms that turned the fields to mud and the rivers to torrents. They fought rearguard actions at Le Cateau, at Saint-Quentin, at Néry. They lost men to exhaustion, to heat stroke, to German shells and machine gun fire. And through it all, the drum followed. It was heard at Landrecies on the night of the 25th, when the 4th Guards Brigade fought a confused night action against German advance units in the narrow streets of the town. Men of the Coldstream Guards reported a steady drumbeat coming from the direction of the forest to the east, even as rifle fire crackled in the darkness and buildings burned. The sound persisted throughout the engagement. When the guards withdrew at dawn, moving south toward the Sambre, the drum went with them. It was heard again at Étreux on the 27th, where 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion, Munster Fusiliers, were cut off and forced to make a stand in a sunken road. The men fought for 6 hours, surrounded until their ammunition was exhausted. Of the 250 men who held that position, only 50 survived to be taken prisoner. But before the position was overrun, several men told their officers they could hear a drum beating somewhere beyond the German lines. One sergeant said it sounded like a regimental march. Another said it sounded like a funeral. By the 1st of September, the phenomenon had spread beyond the Royal Fusiliers. Men from the Middlesex Regiment, the Royal Irish Rifles, the Gordon Highlanders, soldiers from units across the British Second Corps, reported hearing the same sound during night marches, during rest halts, during the brief, exhausted hours when they tried to sleep in barns or ditches or open fields. It was always distant, always steady, and it was always louder near the rear guard, near the men who were closest to the enemy. Captain Osborne continued to document the reports. He noted that the sound was never heard during actual combat. It did not appear in the chaos of battle, when artillery roared and rifles cracked and men shouted orders that could not be heard. It appeared in the quiet moments, in the lulls, in the eerie, tense silences when the enemy was near but not yet visible. He noted also that the men who heard it most clearly were often those who had been at Mons on the 23rd. It was as if the drum had marked them. On the 2nd of September, near the town of Coulommiers, a chaplain attached to the 1st Battalion, Northamptonshire Regiment, recorded an unusual conversation in his field journal. An elderly French woman, fleeing south with her family, had stopped the chaplain on the road and asked him if the British Army still used drummer boys. The chaplain said no, that practice had ended years ago. The woman seemed confused. She said she had heard drumming the night before, coming from the British encampment near the village. She said it had reminded her of stories her grandmother had told, stories of the old wars, when armies marched with drums and fifes and the sound could be heard for miles. The chaplain asked her what the stories said. The woman told him that in the old days, when a regiment was doomed, when it was marching toward destruction, a phantom drummer would sometimes join the column. The drum would play, she said, but no drummer could be seen. It was an omen, a warning, and it meant that death was walking with the soldiers. The chaplain thanked her and moved on. But that night in his tent, he wrote that he had heard the drum himself. He wrote that it had a peculiar quality, neither loud nor soft, but somehow present, like a sound heard through water or through the walls of a dream. He wrote that it made him uneasy in a way he could not explain. On the 5th of September, the retreat ended. The British Expeditionary Force, along with the French 5th and 6th Armies, halted along the Marne River and turned to face the Germans. The Battle of the Marne would rage for 4 days. It would save Paris. It would turn the tide of the war. But on the night before the battle, as the men of the Royal Fusiliers prepared their positions along the river's northern bank, cleaning rifles and fixing bayonets and writing letters they did not expect to send, more than a dozen soldiers reported the same thing. The drumbeat had stopped. For the first time since Mons, the night was silent. The British Expeditionary Force crossed the Marne at dawn. They moved over pontoon bridges and stone spans still intact, advancing north into the gap that had opened between the German First and Second Armies. The morning was cool and overcast. A low mist clung to the river valley, drifting between the villages and vineyards that climbed the slopes beyond the water. For the first time in 2 weeks, the British were not retreating. They were attacking. The 4th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, crossed at Sassy-sur-Marne and moved northeast toward the village of Montreuil-aux-Lions. They advanced in extended order, section by section, through fields of stubble and stands of beech trees still green with late summer growth. The German rearguard had pulled back during the night, but contact was expected at any moment. The men moved cautiously, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning the tree line ahead. By mid-morning, they had reached the outskirts of Montreuil. The village was small, perhaps 30 houses clustered around a stone church with a slate roof and a square bell tower. Smoke rose from several buildings. The streets were empty. Lieutenant Colonel McMahon deployed 2 companies in a skirmish line and sent scouts forward to clear the buildings. It was Corporal Holbrook, the same man who had first reported hearing the drum at Mons, who found the body. It was lying in the road at the edge of the village near the churchyard wall. A German soldier, a young private from a Prussian infantry regiment, shot through the chest. He had been dead for several hours. His rifle was gone, but his pack and equipment remained. What drew Holbrook's attention, however, was not the body itself, but what lay beside it. A drum. It was a military side drum, the kind used by regimental musicians in the old armies. Wooden shell, calfskin heads, rope tensioning. It was badly weathered. The wood was cracked and stained dark with age. The heads were split in places, brittle with decay, and yet it appeared to have been carried recently. There were marks in the dust around it, as if it had been set down carefully, deliberately. Holbrook called for his sergeant. The sergeant examined the drum, turned it over, ran his fingers along the shell. He said it looked like something from a museum. Too old to be in use. Too old to have survived this long in field conditions. And yet here it was, lying in the road beside a dead German soldier in a village 40 miles north of the Marne. Lieutenant Colonel McMahon was informed. He came forward to inspect the drum himself, accompanied by Captain Osborne and the battalion adjutant. McMahon crouched beside it, studying the markings on the shell. There were no regimental insignia, no identification stamps, just a series of faint, hand-carved symbols, letters or runes worn nearly smooth by time. He ordered the drum brought back to the battalion headquarters for examination. But when the order was given, no one moved. The men stood in a loose circle around the drum, rifles slung, watching it. No one spoke. After a long moment, Corporal Holbrook said quietly that he did not think it should be touched. He did not explain why. He simply said it should be left where it was. McMahon asked him why he thought that. Holbrook hesitated. Then he said that the drumbeat they had all heard during the retreat, the sound that had followed them from Mons, had stopped the moment the British turned to attack. He said it had stopped because the retreat had ended. And he said that if they took the drum, if they moved it from where it lay, the sound might return. McMahon regarded him for a moment. Then he stood and ordered the drum photographed and left in place. No one was to touch it. The battalion would move on. But that afternoon, as the Royal Fusiliers advanced beyond Montreuil and engaged German positions near the Petit Morin River, the drumbeat began again. It was faint at first, almost inaudible beneath the crack of rifle fire and the distant rumble of artillery. But as the afternoon wore on and the fighting intensified, more men began to report it. It was coming from behind them, from the direction of the village. It was steady and slow, like a march cadence played at halftime. And it was growing louder. By evening, the sound was unmistakable. Men in the reserve companies resting in a tree line south of the river heard it clearly. Some said it sounded like it was coming from the church in Montreuil. Others said it was moving, following the battalion's line of advance. Captain Osborne walked back toward the village at dusk to investigate. He reached the churchyard just as the light was failing. The drum was gone. The body of the German soldier remained where it had fallen, but the drum had been removed. There were no tracks in the dust, no sign of disturbance. It had simply vanished. Osborne returned to the battalion and reported his findings to McMahon. McMahon said nothing. He stood for a long time, staring north toward the German lines, listening. The drumbeat continued through the night, steady and unhurried, a sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. And in the morning, when the battalion moved out to continue the advance, the drum followed. The Battle of the Marne ended on the 9th of September. The German armies withdrew north, abandoning their drive on Paris, falling back toward defensible positions along the ridgelines that overlooked the Aisne Valley. The British pursued them. They crossed the Marne again, moved through the forest of Compiègne, and on the 13th reached the river itself, a slow, dark waterway, flanked by steep wooded slopes and crowned by a limestone escarpment that would, in time, become one of the most blood-soaked pieces of ground in France. The Chemin des Dames, the Ladies' Road, ran east to west along the crest of the ridge, a narrow farm track built in the 18th century for the daughters of Louis XV. From the ridge, you could see for miles in every direction. It was a perfect defensive position. The Germans knew it. They had blown the bridges at Villy and Bourget-Comin, dug trenches along the ridgeline, and sighted their machine guns to cover every crossing point. The British attacked on the morning of the 13th. The 4th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, crossed the Aisne on pontoon bridges south of Villy under heavy shell fire. They climbed the wooded slopes beyond the river in sections, using the cover of the trees, advancing uphill through undergrowth and fallen timber, while German machine guns swept the ridgeline above. The fighting was close and brutal. Men fell without seeing the enemy. Others made it to the crest, only to be driven back by counterattacks launched from the German reserve trenches. By nightfall, the battalion had established a tenuous foothold on the lower slopes of the ridge, but had been unable to break through to the crest. Casualties were severe. A company had lost half its strength. B Company was down to 60 men. The survivors dug shallow scrapes in the chalky soil and waited for the inevitable German counterattack. It came at 0200 hours. The Germans attacked downslope in the darkness, moving quietly until they were within 50 yards of the British positions. Then they opened fire. The night exploded into noise and muzzle flashes, and the shouts of men fighting at close range. Grenades were thrown. Bayonets were fixed. The British line buckled but held. And through it all, beneath the rifle fire, beneath the screams and the explosions, men reported hearing the drum. It was louder than it had ever been before. It was not distant. It was among them, in the trenches, on the slope, as if the drummer were walking the line. Corporal Holbrook, commanding what remained of his section, later swore he heard it directly behind him during the height of the attack. He turned to look, but saw nothing. only darkness and smoke and the shapes of men struggling in the chaos. The Germans withdrew at dawn. The British held their ground. But the cost had been terrible. 37 men of the 4th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, were dead. Another 60 were wounded. And something else had changed. Lieutenant Colonel McMahon was among the dead. He had been hit by shrapnel during the counterattack, killed instantly while moving between positions to rally his men. Command of the battalion passed to Major Geoffrey Barton, the senior company commander. Barton was a veteran of the South African War, steady and unflappable, but he had not been with the battalion at Mons. He had joined them during the retreat, coming up from a depot unit to replace casualties among the officers. When Captain Osborne briefed him on the situation, the state of the battalion, the casualties, the dispositions, Barton listened in silence. Then Osborne mentioned the drum. He told Barton that the men had been hearing it since Mons. He told him it had followed them through the retreat and that it had reappeared during the Marne offensive. He told him that many of the men believed it was connected to the battalion's fortunes, that it appeared before or during moments of crisis. Barton asked if Osborne believed that. Osborne said he did not know what to believe. He said only that the sound was real, that too many men had reported it independently, and that it had a measurable effect on morale. Some men found it unsettling. Others found it strangely reassuring, as if they were not alone on the line. Barton considered this. Then he said that whatever the drum was, whether real or imagined, whether omen or coincidence, it would not be discussed further. He said the men were exhausted and traumatized, and that dwelling on unexplained phenomena would only make things worse. He ordered Osborne to make no further entries about the drum in any official record. Osborne obeyed, but he continued to hear it, and so did the men. On the night of the 14th, as the battalion held its positions on the slope and listened to the Germans digging in above them, the drumbeat became so loud that several men asked their officers if a band had been brought up from the rear. The officers had no answer. There was no band. There were no musicians within 5 miles of the front line. And yet the drum played on, steady, relentless, a cadence that matched the rhythm of digging, of breathing, of hearts beating in chests slick with fear and mud and sweat. By the 16th of September, the British offensive on the Aisne had stalled. Both sides began to dig. The trenches deepened. Barbed wire was strung. Machine gun nests were reinforced. What had begun as a pursuit had become a siege. The war of movement was over. The war of attrition had begun. And still, the drum beat on. The British Expeditionary Force was withdrawn from the Aisne in early October and shifted north to Flanders, where the Germans were making a final attempt to break through to the Channel ports. The town of Ypres, a medieval market city ringed by ramparts and moats, stood at the center of a shallow salient that bulged into the German lines. It would be defended at all costs. The 4th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, arrived at Ypres on the 18th of October and took up positions in the village of Zonnebeke, 3 miles northeast of the town. The ground was flat and waterlogged, crisscrossed by drainage ditches and farm tracks. The fields were empty, the villages abandoned. The civilians had fled weeks before. The drumbeat had not stopped. It had followed the battalion from the Aisne through the rail journey north, through the march into Flanders. The men no longer spoke of it openly, but they heard it in the quiet moments before dawn, in the lulls between artillery barrages, in the long, cold nights when they huddled in their trenches and listened to the wind across the fields. Captain Osborne noted in his private journal that the sound had become part of the landscape, as constant and unremarkable as the rain or the distant rumble of guns. He noted also that the men who had been at Mons, the original soldiers of the battalion, the ones who had heard the drum first, were fewer now. Many had been killed, Others wounded and evacuated. Replacements had come up from England, young men with fresh uniforms and no experience, and they did not hear the drum. Or if they did not know what it meant. On the morning of the 19th, the German Fourth Army launched its main assault. 6 divisions attacked along a 10-mile front, driving toward Ypres through Langemarck and Poelcapelle and Passchendaele. The fighting was savage. German infantry advanced in massed formations, singing as they came, and were cut down by British rifle fire in rows. The British lines bent but did not break. The 4th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, was engaged near Zonnebeke throughout the day. They held a section of trench line that ran through an old churchyard, the graves torn open by shell fire, the headstones shattered. They fought for 12 hours without relief. Ammunition ran low. Water ran out. Men fell asleep standing upright, leaning against the trench walls, too exhausted to move. And then, at 1600 hours, the drum stopped. It did not fade. It did not diminish. It simply ceased, as if a hand had reached down and stilled it mid-beat. The silence was immediate and absolute. Corporal Holbrook noticed it first. He was in the fire trench, rifle in hand, watching the field to the north where the German attack had stalled. He turned to the man beside him, Private Leonard Clark, one of the original Mons veterans, and asked if he heard it. Clark said he heard nothing. Holbrook said exactly. The drum was gone. Within minutes, word spread along the trench. Men who had heard the drum for 2 months, who had grown accustomed to its presence, now felt its absence like a physical weight. Some were relieved, others were unsettled. A few said it meant the worst was over. But Corporal Holbrook did not think so. He said it meant the opposite. At 1800 hours, the Germans attacked again. This time, they came in overwhelming strength. 3 regiments, supported by artillery, advancing across the open ground between Zonnebeke and Broodseinde. The British line was too thin to hold. The 4th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, reduced now to fewer than 300 men, was overrun in less than an hour. Major Barton was killed, leading a counterattack near the church. Captain Osborne was wounded by shrapnel and evacuated. Corporal Holbrook died holding a section of trench that had no name, no number, no marker on any map. Private Clark survived long enough to be taken prisoner, but died of his wounds 2 days later in a German field hospital. By nightfall on the 19th, the 4th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Of the 700 men who had crossed the Channel in August, fewer than 60 remained. They were pulled out of the line on the 21st and sent south to refit and absorb replacements. The drum was never heard again. Not by the reconstituted battalion that returned to the front in November. Not by the new soldiers who joined them. Not by any unit of the British Expeditionary Force in any sector of the line for the remainder of the war. Whatever had followed them from Mons, whatever had beaten that slow, relentless cadence through 2 months of retreat and advance and slaughter, had fallen silent at Zonnebeke. And the men who had heard it, the men who had known it, were gone. The war ended on the 11th of November 1918. The guns fell silent, the armies came home, and in the months that followed, the British War Office began the long process of compiling the official histories, sorting through millions of pages of reports, diaries, letters, and field documentation to construct a narrative of what had occurred. It was during this process that a clerk in the historical section came across Captain Arthur Osborne's field journal from the autumn of 1914. The journal had been among Osborne's personal effects when he was evacuated from Zonnebeke, and it had made its way through the medical system to a depot in England where it had sat in storage for 4 years. The clerk read it with interest, then with confusion, then with something approaching alarm. The entries about the drum were detailed and consistent. They spanned 2 months. They included corroborating testimony from multiple witnesses, officers, and enlisted men from various units, all describing the same phenomenon. The clerk brought the journal to his supervisor, a lieutenant colonel who had served with the Expeditionary Force in 1914 and knew the campaign well. The lieutenant colonel read the relevant passages. He asked the clerk if there were any other records that mentioned the drum. The clerk said he had found passing references in 3 other documents: a chaplain's diary, a letter from a sergeant in the Middlesex Regiment, and a marginal note in a battalion war diary that had been struck through but was still legible. The lieutenant colonel thought for a long time. Then he asked the clerk to pull all related documents and bring them to his office. He said nothing more. Over the next 2 weeks, the lieutenant colonel reviewed every available record from the units that had been present at Mons and during the subsequent retreat. He found 17 separate mentions of the drumbeat, 17 independent accounts spread across 6 different battalions, all describing the same sound. Some were brief, a single sentence in a diary. Others were longer, more detailed, but the pattern was unmistakable. He also found the photograph. It had been taken by a Signal Corps photographer attached to the 4th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, on the 6th of September 1914 in the village of Montreuil-aux-Lyons. The photograph showed a dirt road, a stone wall, and a body, the German soldier that Corporal Holbrook had found. And beside the body, clearly visible in the foreground, was the drum. The lieutenant colonel studied the photograph under magnification. The drum appeared ancient, far older than anything that should have been in use in 1914. The carvings on the shell were visible, but indistinct. He could not make out what they depicted. He made inquiries. He contacted the Imperial War Museum, the British Museum, the Royal Military Academy. He asked if anyone could identify the drum, if there were any records of such an instrument being used by British or German forces. No one had answers. The drum did not match any known pattern. The symbols on the shell were not German, not French, not British. In late March, the lieutenant colonel was contacted by a professor of folklore at the University of Edinburgh who had heard of his inquiries. The professor said he had come across a reference to a similar drum in his research on Belgian folk traditions. He said that in the oral histories of Hainaut, the province where Mons was located, there were stories of a phantom drummer that appeared before battles. The drum was said to be a remnant of older wars, older armies, older times. It was said to belong to a regiment that had been destroyed centuries ago, and that its drummer still marched, still played, still kept time for soldiers who no longer existed. The professor said the legend was almost certainly apocryphal, but he found it interesting that the stories were specific to Mons and that they had persisted for generations. The lieutenant colonel thanked him for the information. Then he returned to his office, gathered all the documents related to the drum, and placed them in a folder marked Anomalous Field Reports, 1914. He sealed the folder and had it transferred to a restricted archive in the basement of the War Office. In his final memo on the subject, dated 28 March 1919, he wrote the following: "The accounts detailed herein cannot be adequately explained by existing knowledge and are not suitable for inclusion in the official history. Recommend suppression pending further investigation. It is the opinion of this office that the phenomenon described was either a mass auditory hallucination brought on by extreme stress, or something for which we do not yet have an adequate framework of understanding. In either case, public disclosure serves no useful purpose." The memo was countersigned by a brigadier and filed with the folder. The documents were not seen again for 60 years. Captain Arthur Osborne survived the war. He returned to medical practice in London and never spoke publicly about the drum. Corporal William Holbrook was posthumously mentioned in dispatches for his actions at Zonabiki. His body was never recovered. The 4th Battalion, Royal Fusiliers, was reconstituted and served with distinction for the remainder of the war. None of the replacement soldiers ever reported hearing anything unusual, but in the archives of the Imperial War Museum, in a box labeled Unprocessed Materials, Western Front, there remains a single item that was never cataloged, never displayed, never examined. It is a drum, wooden shell, calfskin heads, rope tensioning. The wood is cracked and blackened with age. The heads are brittle and split, and along the shell, barely visible beneath centuries of wear, are carved symbols that no one has yet been able to translate. The drum sits in the dark, in storage, in silence. But those who have worked in that section of the archive say that sometimes, late at night, when the building is empty and the lights are low, you can hear something. A beat, steady, distant, relentless. The sound of a drummer who has never stopped marching.